Welcome to the second session of the ongoing series State of the Nation, organized by Princeton University's Office of Population Research, directed by Sanyu Majola. My name is Doug Massey, and I'm chair of the organizing committee for the series, and I'm pleased to introduce today's session on the state of Black America. The session will be moderated by the celebrated public intellectual Ta-Nehisi Coates, who will participate in a discussion of four distinguished Princeton faculty members who have made seminal contributions to the study of racial stratification in the United States. Ta-Nehisi Coates is an award-winning author and journalist. He's the author of the best-selling books, The Beautiful Struggle, We Were 8 Years in Power, The Water Dancer, Between the World and Me, which won the National Book Award in 2015. He was a recipient of a MacArthur Fellowship in the same year. As a journalist with a career spanning over 2 decades, he's written for numerous publications, including the Washington City Paper, the Village Voice, the New Yorker, and the New York Times. As the national correspondent for The Atlantic between 2008 and 2018, he penned numerous articles and essays, including the National Magazine Award-winning 2012 essay, Fear of a Black President, and the influential June 2014 essay, The Case for Reparations. Ta-Nehisi will soon be able to add screenwriter to his list of credentials. He's currently writing the screenplays for the upcoming films Wrong Answer, Superman, and the film adaptation of his first fiction novel, The Water Dancer. While his successful run writing Marvel's Black Panther came to an end in April 2021, he continues to write Marvel's Captain America, and he's currently in his 4th year as a distinguished writer in residence at NYU's Arthur L. Carter Journalism Institute. We're very pleased and honored to have him with us today. Our 4 faculty panelists include Frederick Wherry, the Townsend Martin 17 Professor of Sociology, President-elect of the Eastern Sociological Society, and a co-author of the book Credit Where It's Due, Rethinking Financial Citizenship, which focuses on the 45 million adults disproportionately Black who lack credit scores and therefore lead separate and unequal financial lives. Catherine Eden is the William Osborne Church Professor of Sociology and Public Affairs and co-author of $2 a Day, Living on Almost Nothing in America, which, as the title implies, focuses on the 500,000 households and 3 million children who live on no more than $2 a day. Keeanga Yamada Taylor is Assistant Professor of African American Studies and the author of Race for Profit, How Banks and the Real Estate Industry Undermine Black Homeownership, a study of how banks and realtors co-opted federal housing policies to stymie Black homeownership in the United States of America. Finally, Pat Sharkey, Professor of Sociology and Public Affairs and the author of 2013 Stuck in Place, Urban Neighborhoods and the End of Progress Towards Black Equality, already a classic book documenting racial segregation's continuing role in perpetuating Black disadvantage. And with that brief introduction, I'll turn the program over to Ta-Nehisi Coates and welcome you all here.
Okay, sorry, I was muted. Frankly, it's an honor to be here in this conversation. I grew a little embarrassed listening to that bio, which is everything from comic books to movies. And that is not a humble brag, because I imagine that a few of you are wondering what the hell I'm doing here. And the reason I'm here is because my roots are as a journalist, but my roots before then actually are as a failed academic. When I went to Howard University way back in the early 1990s, I thought I would, have the, great privilege of being on a panel like this. I thought I would be a historian. And I think like in my own work, that never really, bent never really left. And I say that to say that whatever accolades were in that biography, up into Captain America, by the way, are really rooted in much of the research and the thinking that has been done by folks that I'm on this panel with or moderating this panel with today. I can't imagine a case for reparations, frankly, without the pioneering work of Douglas Massey, without Patrick Sharkey, We had many conversations in that time without, stuck in place. Much of the argument in there was rooted, in notions of place-based segregation and, ideas of wealth and, class remedies, et cetera. I've had the luxury of being in conversation a couple times with Kian, who I feel like has really advanced the conversation in terms of housing and where that was in 2014 when I was writing on it. And certainly the work of Kathy Eden, who I think, and I'm going back a few years now, but I think has done did a phenomenal job in, how do I put this, removing some of the moralism around fatherhood and Black men in the inner city in particular. That is an idea and a notion that I wrote about in memoir form, and to see some of that scholarship added to it and to see it given some nuance and some complexity that went beyond some of the hectoring, I think was just a tremendous contribution. And Professor Wary, who I'm getting to know now, right now, I'm not going to fake it and act like I was familiar before we were doing this forum, but I'm getting familiar and just looking forward to being educated. So I say all that to say it's a privilege to be here, guys. It really is, and I'm looking forward to a dynamic dialogue. As I was saying before, I wish we were in person, but we're not. And we're gonna, still make it do and make it look like we were in person. So I don't know if we had a designated order, but going by the bios, Professor Wary, would you mind starting with that? Would that work?
That works fine for me.
Okay, beautiful. And I think what we had 15 minutes per presenter, I believe.
Okay.
So we'll do that and then have a conversation. Does that work for everybody?
Yeah, that works. Hold on.
Okay, beautiful.
Stop share. Let me share the right screen. Did the share work?
It says you're sharing, but I don't see any graphics.
Okay. Let me just do it one more time. Hold on. So. There we go.
Yes, great.
Okay. So while it will come as no surprise that Black debt is up and Black wealth is down, it should be self-evident that Black financial wellness has declined because of what the government has done and what it's left undone. The list is long, so we won't tackle it as a list, but were we to do so, we'd have to say that the ratio of Black wealth to white wealth declined steadily from 16% to 10% between 2000 and 2018. We point out that the average student loan debt for Blacks climbed from 14,000 to 37,000 over the same period. And we note that while Blacks and whites are getting cars at around the same rate in terms of proportion of population, Blacks are paying more when they finance those cars. Now, before we jump to any conclusions about what Black people need to do to get out of this predicament, let me say that there are some things that individual behavior alone cannot do. There are some financial arrangements that are only made possible by what the government does and what it neglects to do. I will begin with how the government helps debt collectors to strip money from Black accounts. And then I'll turn to how the government continues to neglect the student loan crisis, a problem that they created that is having a disproportionate impact on Black financial wealth. If your life is anything like Yolanda Fountain Henderson's, you know what the government's done. She was profiled in a ProPublica piece by Paul Keel and Annie Waldman back in 2015. Ms. Henderson is the mayor of a small town just outside of St. Louis, and she looked down her block at the 16 houses arrayed on either side of the street. She knew that half of those houses had someone in them who had been sued by a debt collector and summoned to court. She also knew this because she was sitting in front of a computer screen talking with the journalist who was showing her the list of names and the addresses for the debt cases. Mayor Henderson knew well many of the names on the list, including her own. She recalled how the sewer company sued her, and she described the moment she discovered that all the money in her credit union account had been seized. It amounted to $382, not enough to pay what she still owed them. While she could say without hyperbole, they are suing all of us, there was no way for most people being sued to know whether they were in a neighborhood like this one bearing the brunt. In 2013, about 4 million workers had their wages garnished for consumer debts, but we know much less than we should about who these debtors are, the differences in where they live and how much they make, and also differences by race. As you can see here in St. Louis County, just under a quarter of the neighborhoods are majority Black, but they account for 41% of the lawsuits. By contrast, majority white neighborhoods underperform the number of lawsuits their residents have compared to their share of the population. While this is not proof of discrimination, it is evidence that the experience of debt collection is different in Black communities versus white communities, at least in terms of size. It will take more work to discern other differences or similarities, and we expect that these racial disparities will vary as they do from county to county. We've only just started our work building the debt collection lab to tackle some of these questions. We learned quite a bit from the eviction lab and worked with January Advisors Data Science Consulting to develop a tool to scrape the online records of county courts so that we could see the debt collection cases being filed in these courts from week to week. In Harris County, Texas, the top 5 plaintiffs in debt collection cases account for 0.2% of the plaintiffs suing in court. They are also responsible for over 44% of the lawsuits. Clearly, a small concentrated group can do a lot of damage. We have data from January 2020 to March 2021 in the first 5 states we've tracked. We'll continue to add states in the coming year with the goal of tracking all the available data across the nation's courts. In Harris County, we have done 2 years of pre-pandemic data as well, and we have issued FOIA requests to add pre-pandemic data across the other states we're tracking. Keep in mind that an estimated 70 million American adults have had a debt turned over to a private debt collector. That's nearly 1 in 3. But how these debts spiral down, landing some people in court and in greater financial precarity is what we need to understand and change. The government has made it possible for these private debt collectors to take debtors to court and to garnish their wages, seize their property, or in some cases, take them to jail. Without strong government support, without the cooperation of the courts, these extractions at this scale would simply not be possible. In October, I will now turn briefly to an area of government inaction to give you a sense of how public policies further burden Black communities. There we go. In October 2019, a group of us gathered here at Princeton to talk about the student debt crisis. It was a meeting that the Dignity and Debt Network co-hosted with the Financial Security Program at the Aspen Institute. By the time we finished that day, a consensus had emerged. The federal loan program began with the best of intentions and during a time when states still provided ample funding for their public colleges and universities. That time, though, is no more. And the loans have become in a lot of cases, debt traps. But after creating this mess with its student loan policies, the government has been slow to clean it up. We know that the student debt crisis has hit Blacks harder than other groups. 12 years after starting college, Black borrowers owe more than what they originally borrowed, but white borrowers have cut their debt in half. This pattern is not a natural one, something that just emerged from a lot of individuals making decisions that best suited their circumstances. It is by design. So I've been working with Charlie Eaton and Laura Hamilton at the University of California, Merced, and with Adam Goldstein here at Princeton to figure out what can be done. And we have a paper under final review at the Roosevelt Institute in which we correct the erroneous notion that canceling student debt is not needed for Americans in general or Blacks in particular. The misunderstandings are largely due to a popular paper by Catherine and Yannelis from 2020, as well as a few other pieces that made the rounds at the nation's major newspapers. These other papers argued that canceling student debt was not a progressive policy. Using the same data as Catherine and Yannelis, we found the opposite. We show that when we practice greatest care and not mixing private student loans with federal student loans, and we look at race alongside assets and net worth, we get a very different picture of what canceling up to $50,000 in student debts would mean. In this way, we are examining squarely the Warren-Schumer cancellation proposal. 3 things stand out, and this is just a quick preview. First, in figure 6, we see that white households in the top 10% of assets would receive an average of $648 in debt cancellation per person. By contrast, white folks in the bottom 20% will receive an average of $2,759 in debt cancellation. That's 4 times as much debt that is canceled. The pattern holds for those in the 20th to 40th percentiles. Most wealthy households don't take out student loans, especially among the white population with more intergenerational transfers of wealth. Second, although more Blacks in the higher asset range benefit from student debt cancellation, this is because the Black upper middle class has less intergenerational wealth. So they have had to borrow more to attend college. They get income returns on their education, but the debt slows down their wealth accumulation. This is why we can think about student debt cancellation as a form of racial reparation and as a way to help close the wealth gap, though this one-time wealth transfer only narrows but does not close the gap. Finally, in figure 7, we draw on W.E.B. Du Bois, who developed the spiral graph in 1900 in order to solve a problem that we're still grappling with today. After emancipation, Black household wealth was low to non-existent. To depict Black and white wealth differences side by side would require running the bars off the page or making the conditions of Black folks visually disappear on the scale. The benefits of cancellation to Black households in the bottom deciles of net worth cannot be overstated, compared with the little that spills into the top. To conclude, we can't fix what we can't see, nor can we fix the things that upon seeing we refuse to understand. And as an academic, I am certainly not by any means a savior of any type. I am here to bear witness to patterns, meanings, and their causes, and to build infrastructures to facilitate witness. Yes, Black financial health is under threat, but I hope that I've impressed upon you that it need not be so. And that's it for me.
Wonderful. I'm sorry, just as a matter of clarification, I just want to be clear on what I saw, and we'll have questions afterwards. But in terms of your earlier presentation, we're talking about debt, period, and then we moved to student debt cancellation, correct?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay, all right. Just wanted to make sure I was clear. Okay, all right, wonderful. All right, next, Professor Eden, would you mind going next? Would that work?
Yes.
Okay.
It's good to see you.
Good to see you.
Welcome to Princeton.
It's so nice. Wow.
Okay. I'm hoping this works. How does it look, Mary Lou?
It looks good.
Okay. Let me just, there we go. That's going to go away in just a sec. All right, can you hear me? Okay, just give me a thumbs up if you can hear me.
I can hear you.
Great. Okay, so I'm going to talk about, unsurprisingly, the safety net, really from 1900 to the present. And this is a presentation co-created with one of our grad students, Liv Mann, who I think is somewhere on that very long attendee list. And we're drawing on a variety of research here, as you can see. So let's begin at the beginning of the 20th century. Families with children were subject to 3 eras of relief during this period: Prior to 1935 in the Social Security Act, many states had a program called mother pensions to help widows who had no source of income and were trying to raise their children on their own, but almost none of the beneficiaries of these programs were white. So in 1935, these programs were replaced by a federal program, the Aid to Dependent Children Program. And you would think things would get better, but by and large, they did not. And that was largely due to the fact that almost all African Americans at the time still lived in the South. So when Southern Black women would apply for relief, their applications were routinely ignored. So-called farm policies also said that you couldn't draw relief if the harvest was on, whether or not you were employed. And there were suitable home requirements where caseworkers came in, sometimes wearing white gloves to see if there was dust on the fireplace mantle, were routinely used to target Black mothers, as were man in the house rules that included midnight raids of people's homes to see if there was evidence of a male resident. So during those years, all the way up to 1962, African American participation in cash relief in the United States was rare, although officially available. It was rarely accessed by African American women with children. Now that changed in 1962. The program was renamed. There was a real flow of Black activism. The national welfare rights organizations also took to the streets. And in response, the Supreme Court wrested control of the ADC, now AFDC program, from the states and put it firmly in the federal ballpark. What we saw is that just by guaranteeing, just by striking down these restrictive paid policies, the welfare rolls tripled. And for a brief period, only about 10 years, we enjoyed in this country a true sense of entitlement where nearly everybody who was eligible for relief in the United States, about 80% of eligibles actually got what was coming to them by law. What happened in the 20th century? Many of you know that we passed.
Professor E,
yes.
Forgive me, but I think part of your share screen is being blocked by 2 gray bars, I believe. Can you
Mary Lou, do you want to go ahead and should I stop sharing and you can do it on my behalf?
Hide your toolbar.
Okay, I thought I did that, but we'll do it again. How does that work?
There's still some black there.
How's that?
You still have one area on to the right there. You didn't.
How's that?
It's better now. I don't have your slides. You didn't send them to me.
Oh, I did, but probably too late. All right. So what happened?
That's actually pretty good.
Okay. What happened in the 21st century? You probably know that we reformed welfare in 1996. And what this really was a move to return control of the relief system in America back to the states. States were giving tremendous flexibility in what to do with the money, and the roles began to plummet. Some people understand welfare reform as a point in time, but it's actually a continual process. It happens more and more every year. And this is mostly because people who are poor stopped getting welfare, not that people were getting less poor. So one way that those of us in the relief world talk about this is a welfare to poverty ratio. Our current program is called TANF, so temporary assistance to needy families. So this is the TANF to poverty ratio. And what we can see is that falling TANF to poverty ratios have had a hugely disproportionate effect on Black children. 41% of Black children in states with TANF to poverty ratios of less than 10% are African American, with much lower rates for Hispanics and whites. So here are these plunging case rolls as expressed by the TANF to poverty ratio. Since that era of entitlement in 1979. But this plays out very differently across the state. So there is a distinctive regional pattern. And lest you miss the obvious point in this regional pattern, and again, those white states are those with welfare programs that are reaching fewer than 10% of poor families with children. Okay, so they're helping almost no one. If we just list all those 0 to 10% states, we can see that 8 of them are in the South. Now, even if you manage to get relief, states can set their own benefit levels and do, and the variation for a family of 3 with no other income, as you can see, is very dramatic. Again, we see the same regional pattern, with most of the southern states experiencing benefit levels, even if they receive anything, which is unlikely, of less than 20% of the federal poverty line. And this has declined over time. In 1970, again, in that era where we were approaching true entitlement, you can see the pattern for states, and you can see that there was a historic pattern in southern states that is only intensified over time. So now we see that the proportion of Black children affected by very low benefit levels and benefit levels of less than 1/3 of the fair market rent are disproportionately felt compared to both Hispanic children and white children. So in sum, in the 21st century, the majority of African Americans live in the 25 states that have the lowest TANF to poverty ratios. Nearly 2/3 are in the bottom half of generosity, and in results I didn't show, they're also subject to the greatest restriction and requirements and the shortest time limits. And the best predictor of these policies is either the number of percentage of Blacks on the caseload or the percentage of Blacks in the state. And of course, we know that this pattern, again, is repeated with Medicaid expansion. So the question I came here to answer is, do these regional patterns matter? I've been working with Luke Schaefer and Tim Nelson to move beyond simple poverty measures to try to get a broader sense of well-being and disadvantage in America. We've been very interested in public health measures. We've been very interested in mobility. So in partnership with the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, we have constructed an index of deep disadvantage that uses machine learning to incorporate all 5 of these measures in a single measure. And we mapped that. We mapped every county and city, the 500 largest cities in the United States, according to this index, which is a multi-dimensional index of disadvantage. And what do we see? Again, we see this same pattern. In this region alone, and here, this is anchored on the right by the PD region on the border of North and South Carolina, and extends all the way west to the Mississippi Delta, which of course, this is Mississippi, this is Arkansas, and this is Louisiana. So if you're not familiar with this map, this is the historic Cotton Belt, the cotton producing region of the United States. It's also been called the Plantation Belt or the Black Belt because of the exceptionally rich soil in these regions and the fact that most of these counties were and continue to be majority Black. So this map probably conjures in your mind another map. The map of enslavement in 1860. And in fact, when we saw the correspondence of these 2 maps, we couldn't believe it. It was just absolutely striking to us. And so with Liv Mann, and this is really her work, I want to emphasize that we looked at the impact of slavery on how states, how counties and cities fared in this index of deep disadvantage, and found that 40% of the variation in index position could be explained by 1860s enslavement patterns, lynching between 1882 and 1930, and a vector of 1960 controls. So these are all factories from a century and a half ago that predict a large portion of where a place ranks in deep disadvantage today. Now, research on the predictors of lynching suggests it was used to limit Black social and economic mobility to keep Blacks down. And our results suggest that it worked and that it operated partially through the mechanism of segregation. But in addition to this, our analysis of violence and upward mobility suggests a positive feedback loop, where over time, these most disadvantaged places are home to reduced upward mobility. And this reduced upward mobility in turn generates violence, which Pat Sharkey's research shows then engenders less mobility. So this suggests that communities in this bottom tier of deep disadvantage can become trapped in cycles of violence and disadvantage. So why should we care about these regional patterns? First, nearly 20% of Black Americans live in the bottom tier, the bottom 10% of places experiencing the deepest disadvantage by this multi-dimensional measure. Now, this is not new. These places have experienced persistent disadvantage over the generations. In fact, they were the very places that gave the war on poverty its face. Of course, Johnson visited a tenant farmer in North Carolina during one of his poverty tours, famously so, and Robert Kennedy, the iconic pictures of visiting Cleveland, Mississippi that you can see on the internet. So these are places that have borne the brunt of great disadvantage for generations. We should also care about place because although we're big fans of one size fits all policies like the child tax credit, the Biden version of the child tax credit, which is fully refundable, we must go beyond those policies to place specific policies in order to restore opportunity and improve outcomes for Black Americans across our nation. Thank you.
No, that was great. It was not great, but it was pretty, wow, pretty striking. Professor Sharkey, you want to go next, and then we'll finish up with Professor Yamada Taylor. Sound good?
Yeah, of course. This is actually going to work well, I think, because I know Kianga is going to talk about the politics of all this.
Take credit for that lineup.
Well orchestrated, Ta-Nehisi. Perfect. And I'm following along with Kathy's point about space, and it's, I can see Doug in my screen right below me. I'm building off of his work as well. So the argument, I'm gonna start with this image, and I know folks will have a visceral reaction to this. So Mary Lou already told me she didn't like starting off here, but I wanted to start with this image of Patricia and Mark McCloskey, the couple in St. Louis, because I think it reflects something about how we have come to think about inequality and respond to inequality in the US that goes well beyond this couple or even one political party. So this is an image from late June of last year, about a month after George Floyd was killed. And this was the night when a stream of demonstrators were marching toward the mayor's home in central West End of St. Louis, and on their way, made their way through the gates outside this couple's home. And they emerged as you see them here, they were barefoot. It was a casual evening for them, but they came armed. They came armed with a pistol and a rifle, shouting at the protesters that this is private property, shouting at them to get out of their neighborhood. And then in the subsequent weeks, they were interviewed by Hannity and Tucker Carlson, and were recorded for a video played at the Republican National Convention, where they recounted the incident that night, but then went further and said that, it wasn't just about what happened to them. They said they want to abolish the suburbs altogether by ending single-family home zoning. This forced rezoning would bring crime, lawlessness, and low-quality apartments into now thriving suburban neighborhoods. This is the quote from their video. So why am I reminding everyone of this couple? I'm doing so because the incident outside their home in St. Louis and their comments, the way that they made sense of it, the way that it became part of a political platform, I think reflects something deeper about American inequality and reflects something that's not just about them. It's not just about the Republican Party. It's about the way that we respond to inequality in the United States. And I'll make this case with 4 points. And the first one, the most important point is this: separation has become the dominant response to major social challenges in the US. So in this nation, we've gotten to a point where we rarely try to come together to solve major social challenges, whether it's racial inequality or injustice, police violence, climate change, the rise in suicide, the opioid epidemic, COVID-19. Instead, our dominant response is to give segments of the population the chance to separate themselves from these problems and avoid their consequence. And so this approach, so I want to make this case in 4 sets of graphs and maps, and I'll go very quickly through the first part. But the clearest origin point is with the modern response to racial integration here. And so I'm going to make all of these points by using data and maps from St. Louis. I'm not from St. Louis, so anybody who's watching can correct any historical inaccuracies here. But I'm relying on the histories that have been written about St. Louis, and also lots of data, particularly from a historian named Colin Gordon, who wrote this fantastic book called Mapping Decline, where a lot of the maps that I'll show you are from. So we know this history from okay, so I lost the Colin Gordon map, sorry about that. But what Gordon's maps show is he starts, so this is a map of redline that you probably all seen. Gordon's maps start much earlier. So he starts with a specific section of St. Louis that back in 1916 was designated as the legal area where Black residents of St. Louis were allowed to live. Okay, so that was the first example. That was a racialized form of zoning. That was declared unconstitutional. The next stage was driven primarily by the real estate industry in St. Louis, where they combined both existing racial restrictive covenants, which required all property owners to sign an agreement that they would not rent or sell their homes to Black residents of the city. Combine that with the practices, the official practices of licensed real estate agents who would lose their license if they sold a home to a Black family outside of a very targeted zone within the city. I just want to make sure I have the rest of these. Okay. And so this combination of practices of this professional industry with legal restrictions on who property owners could sell their homes to boxed in the Black population within St. Louis. This practice then extended to the practice of redlining. And on your map, if you see on your screen, sorry, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but right over this empty, what looks like an empty area, which is Forest Park in St. Louis. Right above that is the area where the McCloskeys live, which was an area that was specifically designated as a location where it was not risky for the federal government to insure home mortgages. Okay, so the red areas of the map and the yellow areas of the map are the areas that were seen as high risk investments. This then translated into unequal access to home mortgage insurance, which then translated into the configuration of investment and disinvestment within the city, and the work that some of which I've carried out and lots of other people have carried out have shown how the consequences of this demarcation of space within cities like St. Louis and their surrounding suburbs has consequences that persist to the day. Okay, so then this extended to urban renewal, and I won't go into the details here, but this is St. Louis, east side of St. Louis before urban renewal and then after urban renewal, when a set of federal interventions into urban, or federally funded interventions into urban space were used commonly to destroy Black communities within cities, to create the interstate highway system, to build new office parks, stadiums like Busch Stadium in St. Louis, the old Busch Stadium in St. Louis, and to consolidate the Black population within specific segments or areas within the city, and also within public housing complexes that reinforced segregation. Okay. Finally, and this is one of Colin Gordon's maps. I don't know what happened. That must have been a late delete that I forgot about it with the others. But this is a map from Colin Gordon's website, Mapping Decline, where we see the next stage. So when Black residents of St. Louis broke the boundary of the city limits and began to move into the suburbs of St. Louis, a different set of practices emerged where areas outside the city started to incorporate, and they were able to do that because of the extreme latitude that local areas have to form new cities in most of the country, not all of the country. So they were able to form new cities so that they weren't annexed, so that they weren't consolidated into more integrated sections of the urban area around them. And that combined with the new use of land use regulations, and particularly large lot zoning, to ensure that the Black population did not make its way into predominantly white communities outside of the city limits. So this history is pretty well known and is documented in American apartheid and lots of histories of particular cities. Ta-Nehisi's article, The Case for Reparations, describes this process and the really shockingly unlawful and fraudulent practices that were common in that example in Chicago. But this is a history that is well known. I think what is less well known is the new forms that this has taken. And I'd say, one recommendation is to go read Kianga's book, Race for Profit, to talk about how the new approach to expanding credit reinforce these processes. But I'm going to talk about a few different forms that this has taken and use the examples, the example of the McCloskeys to make this case. So this is these are the gates outside the McCloskeys' neighborhood. They are fortified, they are armed. You cannot make your way into that community through these gates. Now, take note that this is in the heart of St. Louis. This is in the central West End, just north of Forest Park, a beautiful part of St. Louis. Google Street View doesn't have these blocks mapped out. These are private streets. These are behind gates. Residents of St. Louis are not allowed to walk through this neighborhood right in the heart of their own city. This is the gate that the protesters broke through to make their way onto the McCloskeys' front yard. And behind, that's their home in the background here. So private security cars patrol the streets at night. This area is contained within the barricades of this gated entry, okay? If you look just north of on the northeast of Forest Park, those are the blocks where the McCloskeys live. When they leave those gates, okay, when they walk east out of their gated community, they walk into a different protected space. They walk into the Central West End Community Improvement District, which is a business improvement district. These, you can see them outlined in the blue lines here. And so there's one to the east, there are three to the north. So it means when the McCloskeys leave their own home, they enter into another set of protected spaces. These are spaces that are where business owners voluntarily tax themselves. Typically, most of the funding from business improvement districts is used for sanitation and for security. Okay, so the private security forces within these districts work hand in hand with the public police departments to enhance security within these spaces. When they walk south, okay, here's an image from a cocktail party that the Central West End Community Improvement District runs each year. When they walk south from their home, they walk into Forest Park. Forest Park is a beautiful space within the city. For anyone who's been to St. Louis, this is the home of all the cultural amenities, or at least the most prominent cultural amenities within the city. Just acres and acres of wooded paths, a golf course, the zoo. This is another protected space. It is a heavily fortified space within St. Louis. It is monitored not just by the police department, but by Forest Park Forever, which is another public-private nonprofit that is given the task of not just beautifying and maintaining the space, but providing security for the space. So every entrance to Forest Park is monitored closely. And again, the private security forces work hand in hand with the St. Louis Police Department. And so there's a question here. How is it that in this city, this urban area, this depopulated, deindustrialized city, the most violent city in the country, how is it that the McCloskeys live this lifestyle, this lavish lifestyle on a quiet, secure, tree-lined street with access to wooded trails, fine dining, golf, culture? And the answer is that they live their lives behind barricades. Okay, this is our nation's solution to extreme inequality. It's our solution to every pressing challenge that faces us. And the barricades that have been used to allow for this response are gated communities, unequal school districts, large lot zoning, interstate highways, local capacity to incorporate new cities, sewer and water districts, jails and prisons. Our form of inequality is about space. And our form of racial inequality in particular is organized in space. This becomes clear when you just look at who lives where within and around St. Louis. So just north of Forest Park, you see the dividing line in St. Louis, where Delmar Boulevard is the traditional dividing line between Black and white St. Louis. The area just above the park is almost entirely white. Okay, a few blocks north, those neighborhoods are entirely Black. You go outside and you see the organization, the racial organization of space in and around St. Louis, and the fragmentation of this area of the country. When you look at maps, so this is data from the Opportunity Insights project developed by Rob Chetty. What it shows you is that the life chances of residents within this area are entirely different depending on where they start. So kids who are born within this census tract where the McCloskeys live end up on average with income that is twice as high than kids born a few blocks north. Okay, 1% of kids in this census tract end up incarcerated at a given point in time in the 2010s. It was 15% of males raised just a few blocks north of the McCloskeys at a given point in time in 2014, I believe, were found within the prison system, incarcerated. When you extend out further, the mapping of the life chances goes hand in hand with the mapping of segregation by racial segregation as well as economic segregation. Okay, and so I just want to end by making the point, and this is based on an article that Keeanga Taylor and I wrote together, along with Yarina Serkez, graphics editor at the Times, and the central point here is to reinforce the idea that racial inequality has been organized in the United States along spatial lines. It is driven by processes of separation, abandonment, disinvestment, and punishment. And its most extreme forms are found in communities, in Black and white communities. So if you look, we ran a set of analyses where we looked at majority Black and majority white neighborhoods within the same metro areas. And mapping these out across, these are all of the largest metro areas in the US, And we just looked at the size of the gap. How does median household income differ between Black and white neighborhoods? And so from left to right, you see the size of the gap between majority white neighborhoods and majority Black neighborhoods. If you look at incarceration, you can see again that this is organized along the lines of communities. This is organized along the lines of neighborhoods, okay? This is not something that is organized at the level of individuals or families. It is organized in space. Home ownership rate, same story. Within MSAs, you just have these dramatic differences in the degree to which Black neighborhoods are occupied by homeowners versus white neighborhoods. Education, same story, unemployment rate, and then life expectancy at birth, where in lots of urban areas across the country, life expectancy of Black Americans is about in Black neighborhoods is about 10 years lower on average than it is in white neighborhoods. Okay, so what these graphs show, I'm kind of hammering this point home, but Black and white Americans continue to live in entirely different worlds. So this is not about individual people like the McCloskeys. It is not about a political party, just the Republican Party. This is about a national policy that has stopped, national approach that has stopped trying to solve major problems and has instead focused on a different goal, separation. And I'll stop there. Thanks.
That's fascinating. I'll just say really quickly before Kiana that, I've said this before, one of the hardest things about, particularly when I was young, about being a young African American is you see things happening in your neighborhood and you cannot understand why. And one of the things I've always been, thankful to you guys for, for the discipline for is the way it clarifies things that are common sense, but now have numbers behind the common sense. Things that you actually visually see qualitatively, measured out quantitatively. So that was impressive. Kiana, you want to round us up? And I did. I mean, I was joking, but we talked a little bit earlier about where you were going to go, and I think given the bent of this panel, I think maybe you could put some of the politics in perspective for us. Let me just say also to the audience, I neglected to say this at the beginning. Some of you have been taking advantage of this, but we do have a Q&A. I'll happily try to integrate some of the questions put in the Q&A into the panel and the discussion that we have following Kiana. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. So I want to do things just a little bit differently. First, I will not have any slides. I'll just be talking. But, I wrote a book about race and housing and really what happens after the Fair Housing Act is passed and why there continues to be racial discrimination in the housing market. But I also have written 2 other books, one from Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation, and then another titled How We Get Free, Black Feminism and the Combahee River Collective, which is to say that I'm also interested in the political abilities of African Americans and their allies to challenge these conditions. And that is some of what I want to spend my time talking about, which is how do we challenge these conditions by looking really to the dynamics unleashed by last year's protests that we're almost at the 1-year anniversary of, not only as a challenge to racist and oppressive policing in the United States, but also the ways that those protests opened up the space to talk about the relationship between oppressive policing and the ways that disproportionate levels of poverty and inequality in Black communities make Black people vulnerable to policing. And so that when we talk about the possibilities of reforming the police, that it cannot happen outside of a discussion about the conditions that make Black communities more surveilled, more patrolled, and that keeps Black communities sharply in the crosshairs of policing. And so I say that just to preface a few remarks that I want to make to bring that dynamic of politics into this into the discussion. The end of the Trump regime has introduced a new period of spending and new perspectives on the place of government aid, not only in the midst of crisis, but also as a lasting remedy to widening gaps of inequality in American life. And so I'm interested in how this came to be, how the spending packages sponsored by and advocated by Biden and the Democratic Party have come to pass really after multiple generations of rank hostility to this particular type of government interventions in the name of social welfare. To that extent, I'm interested in how the pandemic not only exposed racist inequities across the United States, but also exposed the dysfunctionality of American infrastructure that would further complicate the ability of the most vulnerable, marginalized, and oppressed to overcome the effects of COVID-19. But how here we can also think of infrastructure, not just as public works or resources, but the personal scaffolding that structures our daily lives. And so what does this dysfunctionality of American infrastructure then look like? Schools unable to open because of their physical disrepair, the lack of systematic approach to testing and the absence of coordination between the state and federal government, the absence of savings accounts meant millions of workers had to place their lives in peril by continuing to work in public. The lack of healthcare, sick days, paid time off, protection from disease. The overrepresentation of African Americans in jobs that raise their contact with the public and thus increase their likelihood of contracting COVID-19. Their concentration in low-wage work also meant that they were more likely to experience layoffs, thus deepening poverty and insecurity in access to food and adequate housing. And our laissez-faire approach to housing, leaving African Americans largely unprotected. Public discussions concerning housing in African Americans often center home ownership, even as the majority of Black people rent. Renters have been devastated by the COVID-19 crisis. These were the wider contexts to the Black rebellion against racist police abuse and violence that swept the country almost 1 year ago, where the pandemic exposed the structural deficiencies embedded in American society. The George Floyd uprising showed that those gaps of inequity were buttressed by deep, abiding racism, what came to popularly be construed as systemic racism. The ferocity of rebellion elevated the conversation beyond its typical limitations. Instead, public discourse sharply pivoted to look at the ways that this society has structured inequality into the daily lives of Black people through unequal access to housing and school, while simultaneously overexposing Black people to debt, environmental hazards, policing, and premature death. Even as the protests last summer were spun out of the outrage concerning the police murder of George Floyd, the uprisings changed the political trajectory more generally, creating the conditions for Joe Biden to win the presidency, 2 Democratic senators to win in Georgia, and for the Democratic Party to engage in social welfare spending at a pace and to a degree unseen in roughly 2 generations. Unprecedented protest made this unlikely legislative agenda materialize. It is also true that the unresolved crisis of police abuse, violence, and sometimes murder creates the perpetual potential for protest, rebellion, and the revival of backlash politics. These backlash politics center critical race theory, 1619, and other perceived pro-Black frameworks, but its corollary objective is maintaining a status quo that has produced historic levels of multiracial economic inequality deaths by despair for white Americans, and other modes of social inequity. In other words, keeping a robust political coalition together that includes young Black people and others disproportionately exposed to police violence intact ensures action not directly related to police abuse requires a focus on ending the American policing crisis. But that is much easier to say than accomplish. Policing may not be the most important political issue in Black life, but its continual reoccurrence is politically destabilizing. The broader context is complicated and points to potential political fault lines. The activist cry to defund the police picked up steam along the margins, even as the party establishment rejected it outright. Democrats were quick to blame the slogan for their unexpected loss of congressional seats and for generally alienating voters. But activists were reacting to a reality that was born out of close inspection of local budgets that revealed outsized spending on policing, even as other necessary programs were cut or altogether eliminated. What these activists were really talking about was the redistribution of resources and money to other programs that they believed would have much more impact on social disorder and tension than the bottomless pit of police budgets. The problem beyond rhetoric for the activist left pushing these debates has been pandemic-driven growth of violent crime rates. In big and mid-sized cities across the country, there have been spikes in murder rates and other violent crime that have resuscitated the crime reactionaries and put reformers on the defensive. A case in point is here, I'm in Philadelphia. In Philadelphia, where the race for the district attorney is perceived to be tighter than it was thought, than it originally thought to be. As incumbent Larry Krasner is challenged by a former prosecutor fired by Krasner as part of his efforts to clean house when he assumed the office in 2018. The Philadelphia murder rate for 2020 has reached 499 killings, which was its highest rate since 1960. It is unknown whether this rising rate of crime will unshackle the forces of law and order, but it does create the pretext for municipalities to slow the momentum for redistributing public funds away from police towards social programs and other parts of the public sector. Elected officials are always loath to be seen as soft on crime or lax in their narrowly defined scope of public safety. And yet these dynamics set the stage for continued confrontation over the issue of policing. Rising crime rates create the pretext for the presence of police. Budget priorities remain fixed in the direction of the police, even as rising crime rates indicate social malaise that require greater public intervention and spending. Thus far, the Biden administration is relying on emergency measures to take the edge off of economic insecurity and hardships sharpened by the pandemic. But the systemic roots to this inequity and its racial dimensions have been largely left intact. There are other facets to this political problem, ending police assaults on Black people, including the entwined efforts to criminalize protest and disenfranchisement in Republican-dominated state houses. Where Democrats may want to defang and deflect political discussions around defund the police, Republicans wish to bury Black political dissent and electoral participation. The high-profile attacks on voting rights intended to disenfranchise Black voters is especially consequential as the Republican Party becomes increasingly authoritarian. But beyond the political regression of the party, the actual content of the party's program represents an existential threat to Black communities, indeed, all communities suffering from the effects of inequality. This makes the discussion as to the continued viability of neoliberalism dangerously premature. We are only a few million votes removed from a further botched, if not completely failed effort at distributing vaccines to the public had Trump won. The scope of Biden's reform packages would be significantly smaller if proposed in any form at all. And Trump's brutal strategy of forcing states to reopen by withholding all federal expenditure would have been absolutely devastating in its impact on Black communities, disproportionately dependent on public expenditure. This makes the right to vote the site of renewed struggle, but this will only be realized if it seems as if it is consequential to vote in the first place. The Democrats understood in the past 2020 election that they would have to overcome the enthusiasm chasm created by the earlier promises from Biden that, quote, not much would change under his presidency. As Trump was hitting the road during a pandemic to drum up support across the country, Democrats came to understand during an unprecedented summer of protest that they would have to make big promises and appear to fight to realize them. The state-led attack on voting rights raises the potential to transform statewide races into national races, as we saw in the Georgia Senate race in January of 2020. Some seemingly consequential state races may look to the national parties for fundraising, volunteers, and attention, further heightening the potential for deeper polarization between the two parties. And deeper polarization slows down the gears of Congress necessary to respond to rapidly changing events and endeavors. These issues and others set the stage for conditions under which the Black, poor, and working class can secure better paid jobs and whether those jobs will be available. All of the issues of vulnerability exposed by the pandemic, African Americans continue to experience at higher rates of unemployment compared to other workers. African Americans continue to experience higher rates of unemployment compared to other workers at 9% compared to white workers at 5%. While poverty grew by 2.4% in 2020 for Black people, it grew by 5.5% for whites. This accounted for more than 2 million Black people being pushed into the ranks of the poor by the pandemic economy. African Americans make up 40% of the unhoused population. Nearly 40% of Black parents of school-aged children faced food insecurity issues in 2020, and Black families were twice as likely to experience food insecurity compared to their white peers. The numbers documenting the dimensions of Black inequality are endless, and they point to the need for dramatic interventions that cannot be satisfied with rescue legislation alone. These problems of poverty and inequality can only be resolved through a substantive redistribution of wealth and resources. And this means that the struggle for good jobs and workplace rights, union rights, will come into sharper focus, as was the case with efforts to unionize Amazon at the Bessemer, Alabama warehouse. Of course, there are many other potential political issues that can arise and create particular problems for Black people, but the crisis of policing, disenfranchisement, job security with living wages and benefits, and the passage of various social and public legislations constitute some portion of what we might refer to as a Black agenda. Thanks.
Wonderful. Well, we got quite a bit to get to. I have many questions. I'm going to actually go back to the top. I have a lot of questions about the nature of a public. I think that's one of the things that I saw emerging in everybody's presentation, even if it was below, the ability to actually unite around some sort of shared idea of what a public should be, what public programs should be, what a public state should be. I want to come back to Pat and perhaps the Kianga too on this notion of who patrols the borders when we have separation and policing and the impact of policing and how palatable that is and some of the consequences that we would rather not see that come along with that. But Professor Weary, can I say Frederick, Fred?
Oh, Fred's good.
Fred's good. Okay, all right. So Fred, I wanted to ask, so we ended on the proposal of canceling student debt. And I have a two-part question, but the first question I want to ask is, in terms of the gap between Black families and white families, Black households and white households, and maybe this was in the presentation, how much does a student debt actually account for?
So that I can't tell you off the top of my head. What I can tell you is that Houle and Addo did a recent analysis where they can clearly document just the how the student loans are widening the racial wealth gap. And I think part of the challenge here is that when there are questions of debt, because debt is privatized, and we don't really see it, and the terms of the debt are privatized, you don't really get a robust public conversation about why is it that you're graduating and then a few years out you owe a lot more than you borrowed, and no one's talking about it. And so there's not a whole lot of it makes it harder to kind of collectively organize around debt because of the nature of how the information around it is privatized.
Understood. And just one more related question, if I could. You hinted at this. I wondered if you, and if this is outside of the range of your study, it's totally fine. But one of the things you hinted at was a retreat, actually, from the state in terms of college level, in terms of higher education, which I think we've all seen, be it in Wisconsin or wherever. Can you talk a little bit about the nexus between that and this crisis of student debt?
Yes, so it's a pretty simple relationship. So as the state retreats, it just gets, the cost of education just gets replaced by these loans. The other thing that happens is that the way the loans are financed means that the rates and the fees are also rising for these borrowers, and so it's simply one of those things where if you're not in the top 10% of endowment wealth in terms of your college or university, and of course most places are not, that's where you really see students getting themselves sort of pulled into these downward spirals. And there's quite a lot of work that happens with the way they're targeted. And so we're doing some additional work on this, but that's as much as I can say about it right now.
I wanted to bring up that notion of the retreat from the state on public education, because I think obviously in a different way that dovetails with some of the stuff that Kathy was talking about in terms of TANF. And I just have to say that anybody that was watching might have saw the faces I was making. But the map you put up, and of course, as you said, you make the immediate allusion to enslavement, you make the immediate allusion to the era of racial terror. The question I have for you is where, and Kianga kind of alluded to some of this, we're in this era right now where some of us are, optimistic, perhaps, maybe overly optimistic about some amount of return to state investment, in the lives of people. The idea of work, I think, is still centered in that. I think we still talk a lot about working people and working families, and maybe not so much about folks who don't necessarily have jobs or the poor. That maybe we aren't quite there yet. I guess the question I have for you is there any sort of movement at all that you've seen to looking at TANF, or I don't know what it would be called if we were in work. Maybe we can just call it welfare if we take it historically. Are we at all moving towards a different kind of vocabulary? I know we've seen some stuff, for instance, around a guaranteed income, that sort of thing. I just wonder whether we're moving at all from where we were in the 90s, for instance.
Yeah, so I think we are. For 400 years in the United States, we've stigmatized and shamed the poor. When during the colonial eras, you can either, if you were a destitute widow, you could either get coal or food, but not both. So we've always operated under this notion that if we help people too much, we would create a pauper class. And therefore, we've tried to make poverty as miserable as possible. Furthermore, in exchange for relief, we've usually demanded people sacrifice their sense of social citizenship. To use T.H. Marshall's imagery, it is if you have to cross the line that separates society from the ranks of the destitute just to get, the average TANF benefit right now in the United States is $428 a month for a mother of two children with no other source of income. So, what the Biden version of the child tax credit has done. By the way, the original child tax credit, which came about during welfare reform, was highly discriminatory against Black children because it did not phase in until you had a certain amount of income, right? So, and it was only available to certain families. But what this new program does is a fundamental departure. It says, we're not going to separate the poor. We're going to treat poor and middle class kids alike. This is profound. I can't think of another example of where we've done something like this. And it sends a social signal, not that you should be stigmatized and shamed, but that your parents are performing a vital job for society and ought to be helped out in that vital role. The second thing is that we're giving people cash. You know, over time, we've done that less and less. We've said, well, they're going to spend it on the lottery, so let's give them an in-kind benefit instead. And states enact all these crazy laws. You know, you can't use your TANF benefit within 50 feet of a casino or your food stamps or whatever. This says, we trust you. We think that you know what's best for your kid, and we trust you. And finally, it's profoundly pro-work and pro-marriage. We could talk about work. You don't have to work to get this benefit, but you don't lose money for working, which has historically been true in all of our relief programs. And generally, we've taxed people $1 for every dollar earned. So it's neutral on work. And you also don't get kicked off if you happen to get married and suddenly, technically, you have two incomes rather than one. So I think it's a profound departure. We're going to start seeing those checks go out to families, I believe, July 15th. And, you know, $66,000 may not sound like very much to most of us, but to the people that I spend my time with, it could be transformational. Maybe in particular in those parts of the South and Southeast that I pointed out where extreme poverty, living on $2 per person per day, is common. It would eliminate, virtually eliminate that kind of poverty in the United States.
Ta-Nehisi, can I just follow up on?
Go ahead.
So, you know, I do think we could orient this whole conversation around these pieces of legislation in the sense that they're, you know, to supplement what Kathy was saying, the approach, the $5 billion in the jobs bill that are designated for community organizations that have formed to confront violence is also a fundamental departure from the federal government's stance on how to deal with violence that's been constant for the past 50 years. The approach to zoning, to land use regulations, that is, again, in this legislation. Now, this legislation may disintegrate, but that said, the approach to zoning and land use regulations is a fundamental departure from the past 50 years. The Obama administration started to talk about affirmatively furthering fair housing again, and that was a big step, just to talk about it and to establish plans to give help to localities that wanted voluntarily to deal with fair housing. So that was a big step, but then it obviously disappeared as Trump came into the office. Well, that's back in this legislation. So I do think, like, all the stuff we're talking about is right now is possible and is in fact in proposals for existing legislation. This hasn't been the case for a very long time. And so, you know, I'm more hopeful, I know, than I have been in decades, and I have been really since Obama came into office and started the White House Office of Urban Policy. But I think, like, for the first time, there are actually active steps being taken to put forth ideas that would represent a major departure from everything that we've all been talking about for the past hour.
Yeah, no, I'm happy you did that because I was going to push on Kathy a little bit. Now I get to push on both of you, Kathy and Pat. And actually, just kind of roll this into a question. You know, I was going to ask Kianga, but I'm interested in all of you guys' response. So, you know, I think I certainly felt the same way, you know, just in terms of, you know, the package, seeing Biden, for instance, openly. We have, you know, a question here about unionization. I know, Kianga, you brought that up, seeing Biden openly, you know, back the idea of unionization for Amazon workers. And yet, you know, I have to say, this is, from my perspective, there are some pretty shaky legs underneath all of this. This is happening at a point where voting rights are under assault. There was an article on 538 early this morning I was reading, and it basically showed, how much legislation has come about over the past few years. And you see one might argue, coincidental occurrence wherein that legislation really begins to increase circa around 2010 or so. You are seeing, I don't want to call it an unprecedented assault, that's probably a bit too much, but certainly an effort to undercut, policies that basically depend on two senators or so, one of whom, is not really interested in any sort of voting rights reform. And so, I have deep questions about the durability of this, especially when I look at, look at those maps, which are history, which seem like long-term patterns. I'm sorry, I'm rambling a little bit. Kiara, I wanted to ask you, I wanted to ask you about that. I wanted you to, put that in historical context, and I wanted to ask the whole panel about that too.
So this, since I've started studying these communities of deep disadvantage, first of all, I didn't know that they were going to be rural. I was shocked, all but a few are rural of these most disadvantaged places. And I didn't know they were going to be in the South. And I've studied South Carolina and Mississippi before, but over the last couple of years, we've been literally driving to every one of these counties and visiting it. We're going to do some more of that this summer. It is, we cannot move forward fundamentally. I mean, we might be able to sneak through this child tax credit, just like we did the earned income tax credit, which is now our biggest anti-poverty program. That could slither through and make a real difference. But I've become more and more convinced, and Liv Mann's research on violence, lynching, slavery speaks so powerfully to this, that if we don't confront the demons of the past, we can't move forward. So you could say that I've been spending the last half a decade rereading A Case for Reparations. That was a turning point for me, that piece. I didn't like it very much when I first read it, but I really like it now. And, it's something has been stolen. And when something has been stolen, you can't just ameliorate its effects, right? You have to return what was stolen. So my deeper passion is around these deep historical forces that we have to confront.
I wanted to.
Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I wanted to say something about the shaky legs, because I think that is absolutely true, and it speaks to the circumstances that have created this possibility in the first place, which I think that, the imprint and impact of the demonstrations last summer cannot be underestimated in doing two things. One is that I believe that it forced the Democratic Party to have to look much further beyond certainly what Joe Biden was comfortable doing. I mean, if we go further back to the primaries, the Democratic Party primaries, really before COVID arrived, he was on the furthest end of the spectrum of the Democratic Party candidates, and really spent most of his time positioning himself as a counterpoint to Sanders and to Warren. And, how do we explain this complete reversal? I think that it has to do with protests, but also the way that the protests organized the backlash on the right, which is to say that Trump was able to just use naked racism as a way to organize the Republican electorate and end up with 8 million more votes, even while losing. And so to me, this set the stage where for the Democrats, it was undeniable that we have to move in big and significant ways to secure our coalition, to keep it intact, and to give it a reason to come out and vote in the first place, because that was also part of the wider discussion, was this voter malaise. No one wanted Biden. And the question was, will people actually come out and vote for this? And that meant that they had to make big promises. And I think to keep this coalition intact under extraordinary, naked, obvious efforts to disenfranchise significant portions of the population, that they have to continue to act in unprecedented ways, as well as roll out incredible get out the vote efforts. I mean, this is an insane situation that we are in, but all of the talk about neoliberalism being over, that we're in a new era, it's as real as the Democrats can keep this coalition together, because you can see what the other side wants to do. I mean, it could not be, they have not been, there are no converts, there are no converts on the other side. There is a kind of unabashed desire to not just take things back to where they were, but to take things back to a period that, most of us are personally unfamiliar with. So that to me makes, some of these developments very exciting, but also very fragile as well.
Can I ask you to talk just a little bit about policing? I think one of the, and you can correct me if I'm getting your basic analysis wrong, but I think one of the interesting cases you've made with quite a bit of evidence is that yes, in fact, you can, if crime is your override. Well, that there are actual negative consequences from violent crime. This is a real thing. Like when you have to worry about whether you're going to get robbed or whether you're going to as I did growing up in Baltimore, whether you're going to get jumped. To speak nothing of actually being shot and killed. There are all sorts of levels of safety. I think about how the first quote unquote nice neighborhood I ever lived in was when my wife went back to school at Columbia in Morningside Heights. And I can't lie, man, when I walked out of her student housing every morning, I breathed a little easier. I mean, that's a very, very real thing that I think sometimes we overlook. Having said that, I think one of the cases you've made, and certainly that is made by defund and abolish, I think, is that there are very real consequences to be paid for that. That the fact that I breathe that free air is being paid somewhere else. The price for that is being paid somewhere else where in fact I used to live. And so it's like this thing, if you want to end theft, you can chop everybody's hands off if that's what you want to do. But perhaps there are better ways. And I wanted you to just talk a little bit about that. I want to pair that with what you were talking about before in terms of separation and how those lines of separation are maintained and how we get to a place where we address social issues, social problems in other ways besides assault.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is one of the problems that we incur in the discussions about what to do about policing. Is that it's often just narrowly, myopically focused on the police as an institution and not on the social conditions that create that create the possibilities of crime, whether that is poverty, whether it is the anger and frustration that comes with deprivation and the ways that people try to manage that. We have to be able to talk about those issues as well, because oftentimes among elected officials, those who are talking about crime policy have no idea what crime is about. They have no idea what the experiences of poor and working class people living in neighborhoods where crime is a reality actually have to deal with. And on the other side, it's often because the police function in such a racist and abusive way that people in those communities have no one to turn to be able to deal with the real issues of crime there. And so I think that it has to be a two-tiered conversation. I think one part of that is dealing directly with issues of abusive policing in the here and now, whether you want to take up the debate of defund or abolish. there are immediate issues to deal with abusive policing, but we also have to deal with the social conditions that give rise to crime in the first place. And I think that, it's a part of the discussion that for abolitionists and for people who wish to deal fundamentally with the issue of policing, are treated as if we are impervious to the issues of crime, and not as, it's a failure to engage this much broader social issue with crime that I think, for most of the people who write about this and who are active in, what I describe as an emerging movement around defund and abolition, are centrally concerned with transforming the conditions in poor and working class neighborhoods that make Black people in particular less vulnerable to crime, that creates conditions that lessen the contact between police and Black people. And you can't do that without dealing centrally with these issues. And I think that for many of us, I certainly have been, I remember quite clearly in Oakland, California, after spending a week in the archives at Stanford, giving a talk on gentrification, leaving that talk and having the largest firearm I've, not like I've seen a lot, but having a very large gun put in my face and demanding my computer and my bag and my wallet, seconds after giving a public talk. And then faced with that reality of, who do you call? Because I wasn't really paying attention to whoever was holding the gun. I was paying attention to the gun. So am I, calling the cops to say that some young Black kid with dreads just held me at gunpoint in Oakland, in East Oakland? Okay. Like that unleashes all sorts of things. And so it's these politics or these ideas don't come from being impervious to crime. It comes from seeing the impact of police and really understanding that the road that we have taken as a society has done nothing to actually mitigate the conditions that create crime in the first place.
You want to pick that up?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I see urban inequality and violence as related in a reciprocal, bidirectional way, in the sense that communities become vulnerable to violence after a process of disinvestment and abandonment. So that's kind of a vague sketch, but to make it more concrete, when institutions decay, when the core set of institutions that hold up every community are abandoned, and public housing complexes start to crumble and are not maintained, and schools become dilapidated, and community centers disappear. After school programs are not well run or not active at all. Parks and playgrounds are not maintained. People start to retreat into their homes and out of public spaces. Libraries don't function. That's when a community becomes vulnerable to violence. So we've had this historical process where it goes back way further, but let's just start in the 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s, as political power and resources started to drift away from central cities, and central city neighborhoods were abandoned. Institutions started to decay, communities became vulnerable to violence, and violence rose. And so to your point, Ta-Nehisi, that was a very real change. And I will say The Beautiful Struggle is just a remarkable book that really was very moving for me to read about your time in Baltimore. For the folks who came on, who caught wind of Ta-Nehisi's work later in his career, read The Beautiful Struggle. That was what alerted me that this is an amazing person and writer. Anyway, to complete the point, through that process of disinvestment and abandonment, we created the conditions for violence to emerge. The response that we then took in the US was a spatial response. And that's kind of my point from the presentation. Like, it's not an accident that a few blocks north of the McCloskeys, 15% of boys born in the 1980s are in prison at a given point in time in 2014. That is our response, to build those barricades, invest in prisons and the police as the response to this pattern of urban inequality. And then in the other direction, violence then reinforces inequality. And that's a point that I think does have to be made. So violence has a direct effect on everyone within a community, but it also makes it harder to envision a different set of responses. So as violence rose last year, you heard immediately the calls to turn back to the police in places that are in Atlanta. The mayor of Atlanta is calling for 250 more police officers. This becomes the knee-jerk reaction to violence because it's been the only reaction in the US for the past 60 years. So we have very clear evidence that when communities turn to local organizations, to residents who mobilize and are supported in their efforts to take back public spaces, when we turn to investing in communities and community organizations, we reduce violence. Communities become safer and they become stronger. But that just hasn't been on the table as a policy response to violence, at least for the past 50, 60 years. It's on the table right now. The $5 billion, and this is proposed by a coalition of anti-violence organizations called Fund Peace, that got in Biden's ear and or staff's ear more likely, and got that into the jobs bill. So there is at least this recognition that a different approach is possible, and that hasn't been on the table in a long time.
Can I jump in here?
Sure. Please.
Pat and I have never talked about this, but what he finds in urban neighborhoods is manifest spatially by county across the South. It is absolutely astonishing how deeply these social divides are felt. And it is in, I grew up in small town Minnesota. Bob Lethnow, who is in our department for a long time, studied the upper Midwest and rural America. And I got down to some of these places and they were so violent. And of course, the data show that these are some of these small towns are some of the most violent places in the United States. So just as we see divestment and abandonment operating within neighborhoods and cities in the North, we see it happening in whole counties and indeed whole metropolitan areas in the South. The city of Albany, which W.E.B. Du Bois called the belt buckle of the Black Belt, Montgomery, Alabama, Selma, Alabama, almost an entirely abandoned city, and so on. All of the Augusta, Georgia. The saddest city that I've recently been in is Tuskegee. Outside of the university, the city is almost totally abandoned. So this connection between abandonment and violence dampening mobility, and then the low mobility and the hopelessness that comes from that, spiking another round of violence, puts places into a structural spiral of disadvantage that's, that I certainly had not seen before I started working in these rural southern cities.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. And Patrick, I really appreciate that comment about the beautiful struggle. I've tried, and I think it's important that, the beautiful is a memoir of me growing up in Baltimore during the crack era. What one might call neighbor-on-neighbor violence. It's featured very, very prominently in that book. One thing I was trying to get across, or Mary, we often see, this conversation about violence, high levels of violence in African-American communities is necessarily counter, to the conversation about the role of policing. And it was pretty manifest, certainly in my time growing up, that was not the case. That folks saw the two, working hand in hand and coming from the same place. I want to ask, and Fred, I don't know if this is going to catch you off balance, but I want to ask both you and Kathy a question, because Kathy, you've been so moving on the one hand, speaking of the data, on the other hand, speaking of what you've seen. And Fred, if you could, I'm interested in whether you could, as clearly as you possibly could, having seen the data, sketch what it means to come out of college, and we'll just focus on that with that kind of debt, because I think what we're talking about is inequality that stretches across quote unquote class, as much as we want to use that. What it means for your life to come out with that extra, I don't know, $40,000, $50,000 in debt. And then Kathy, if you could just speak some more about what you've actually seen on a qualitative level in your research, what it means to live, under the kind of weight that you've outlined.
Yes. So one way to think about it is your first big experience with finance for a lot of these students, particularly when they get behind their debt payments, they start to get contacted by debt collectors. And they have written in to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and they have said, look, they're calling me at work. They called my boss's cell phone. I'm getting talked to at work. I'm worried about sort of what this means for my job. And they're basically saying, I've never known that I could be treated this way. And so there's a way that you can treat someone who is behind in payments that goes beyond anything that most of us imagine. And so you have people who are afraid to answer the phone. You sometimes have episodes where a kid gets harangued because that's the way you get the parent to then take the telephone. And so there are all these things that happen to people that tell them that sort of they are not worthy of protection. And so one of the things that we see with the debt crisis is that suddenly they can do things to you. You're not worthy of protection, and nothing is out of joint. And so there are other moments where we can imagine people being hounded in this way. It would be unconscionable. And there would be a sense that you actually have a right to some kind of redress or protection. And so that's kind of what it starts to look like. You also have these young people are making different decisions about, when they can get married or when they can buy a house. And so, your entry into the Black middle class is one in which you're both entering at a moment in which you're financially at a disadvantage, but in which your stature has changed in your family and community. So you're trying to help as you rise, and you're doing it with just very little. And so you have people who are, to put it, to understate it, they're a little stressed out. So that's what it looks like.
Yeah, I know. Like one of the things that I often saw. When I graduated, obviously a number of folks who were, first in their family to graduate, and family is in, they got the debt from college, but they also got family. Yeah. You know what I mean? Because they're in a privileged place themselves as compared relative to the rest of their family. Yeah, but they're also going to be getting requests from family and friends for assistance. And so what we do know is that if you're Black, you're going to have more family and friends who are going to be in need of assistance. And we do that privatized personal safety net, the Bank of Fred and the Bank of others. And suddenly, and all this money's going out. And so even if you hold income and occupation and education constant, you're just going to have less available to put into asset building. And so that's the other thing too, is that there are all these other social ties that affect the way we're making decisions about our money. And we have no other sort of forms of protection when we're being hounded by unscrupulous collectors. Kathy, you want to talk a little bit about what you said? Yeah.
Yeah, well, I hesitate to say too much because, Fred was born in rural South Carolina and raised, but we've been studying one side in this historic cotton belt, Greenwood, Mississippi. Of course, this is where Freedom Summer was headquartered. This is where the first national headquarters of the White Citizens Council was. It's where Stokely Carmichael gave his, who doesn't go by that name anymore, gave his Black Power speech, kind of the heartbeat of the civil rights movement in that part of the country. But it was the king of cotton. And that collapsed at about 1965. And since then, there's been a single economic savior in the town. So first it was Baldwin piano, and then it was the Takata seatbelt. factory. And after that, it was Viking stoves, the first luxury stove for home use. And when that started to falter, literally, the city was saved by the movie The Help coming to town, which was filmed in Greenwood. And then it was, interestingly, Milwaukee Tool, who had been paying, the catfish were in there too, the catfish farming. But Milwaukee Tool said, gee, I got to pay people in Milwaukee $18 an hour, but I can get them in Greenwood for $9 an hour because there's no competition for labor. I'll be the only employer in town. And so they've just expanded their operations there. But what, one of our respondents said, Greenwood is a low-income town. You can't put lipstick on a skunk. And other than, the white middle class, you have this large landless, mostly landless labor pool making too little to survive. And the white part of town is North Greenwood. The south part of town is South Greenwood. And if you talk to people in the north side of town, things are beautiful. Tree-lined highways, stately homes. They all go to the white kids go to a segregationist academy, Pillow Academy, founded by the same man who founded the White Citizens Council. But if you go to the black part of town, every person we talk to said, this is worse than Memphis. I can't even go outside. I'm hunkering down in my home. My kids can't even go play in the park. And, we subscribe to the Greenwood Commonwealth, and the murders are and of course, they too are looking to hire more police. But it is really interesting how, there are not the barriers that Pat's talking about in these, sort of special districts, but the social barriers are so well understood. And they've been practiced for generations because of the segregation, right, that's come before, and the racial terror of lynching, that life goes on in one little town of 13,000 people as if these two groups didn't live even in the same world.
Pat, I had a question for you from the audience of whether the kind of spatial dynamics that you see in the United States, whether they are unique to here, and how they're practiced and to the extent that they exist, with other, I guess, comparable communities to African Americans in other countries. Have you done much research internationally? Have you done much reading, the literature internationally?
Well, the key, just real quick, the key to the United States is federalism. We give a lot of control to states that other places don't. Pat.
Yeah, that's right. And we also give a lot of control to localities. What happened in St. Louis happened because these small unincorporated areas decided, I don't want to be a part of that city. And so they formed their own city. And it doesn't take much to do that in Missouri. And they formed their own city with their own land use regulations, so that the practices that used to be carried out by law and by real estate agents were then carried out by small groups of residents who wanted to be in an entirely white setting and didn't want Black residents to encroach into their community, and also didn't want the tax burdens that come with concentrated poverty, which became so clear in the city of St. Louis. So I happen to have I was trying to answer Jake Rosenfeld's question online, and so I'm halfway through it. So let me just answer orally instead. So I think Jake's exactly right. I happen to have spent, my wife worked for several years in South Africa, and I happen to have spent some time there, and was just shocked at the what I'm describing now, but kind of on steroids, in the sense of, you have the townships, which were always designated for the Black population of South Africa. So the remnants of apartheid are still present, did not go away. A lot of the processes that William Julius Wilson documented here, with the expansion of civil rights and the movement of middle and upper income Black Americans outside of the traditional ghetto, happen again on steroids in South Africa, where the more advantaged segments of the Black population move out of traditional Black areas. And then you have just extreme concentrated poverty in the townships. But then also you have these processes of separation and the formation of barricades in a much more extreme way through lots of neighborhoods in, I spent a lot of time in Cape Town. And it's just really remarkable, the fences around every home, the security guards at the end of blocks in South Africa. So a lot of the processes that are very visible here were in your face in at least in Cape Town, and some of the rural places where my wife happened to be doing her research. And so I was sitting with my redheaded kids walking down these rural streets in Harding in South Africa. I think the processes are very different in Europe and look very different. So there's huge variation here, but Jake, it's a great question. These are not processes that are exclusive to the US.
And Kianga, can we finish up with you? I wanted, you alluded to this in your notes, but there was a question in relation to this. Could you speak more? There also seems to be great, attention to the importance of unions and unionization. In my profession as a journalist, you see journalists, are now increasingly unionizing themselves. Can you speak a little bit to the prospect of this, where this sits within our politics? You're on mute.
I mean, I think there's a little bit of a mismatch between the growing desires for unionization and, a kind of reckoning or awakening or lack of awakening with the traditional trade union leadership in this country, in the AFL-CIO. And so I think that what you have is some level of recognition that with unionization comes higher wages, comes some level of job security, comes some measure of guaranteed benefit, which I think has particular resonance as the kind of glow of the gig economy ascends, where it's every person for themselves. I think the appeal of the stability inferred by unionization means something. I think even when you look at particular groups, African Americans who have union jobs, have higher wages and salaries than those who don't, disproportionately higher. So I think all these realities have meant that for the general public, there's greater interest in unions and being unionized. And, at the same time, I think that there is a sclerosis among the trade union leadership that, derive their income and their job security from simply existing and not necessarily from increasing rates of unionization. Many of these people often find themselves closely allied with political leaderships and look to help to ease in political programs and not make political waves. I mean, this is how you can get Randy Weingarten, saying without any kind of particular democratic process that schools will be open, that there will be no obstacles to everyone going back in person next fall. And I think you can, trace the breadcrumbs to that back to her particular role in the Biden administration. And so there's a disconnect between the potential for a much larger proportion. I think that we are down to something like 6% of the U.S. workforce actually being unionized, which is way out of proportion to the desire of people to be in unions. And so, I think that it just means that there will be a lot of kind of unauthorized attempts to sign people up. I think the sorts of campaigns, the individual campaigns that we've seen at campuses with graduate students and contingent employees, I think that is sort of the wave of the future, while there is the potential for this political confrontation with a leadership that doesn't seem to offer much direction, even as, millions of people want to be unionized right now.
Awesome. This was just excellent for me. It was exactly what I needed. Kathy, I will say is, what's really interesting about you saying that about the case for reparations, and this kind of reinforced it, listening to you guys, because what was in the background all the way was how we evolve into a place where, as I was saying, we have a public that recognizes some sort of shared interest.
Yeah.
And while on the one hand, I certainly don't, back away from what I wrote in 2014, I definitely have spent a lot of time thinking about how, well, on the one hand, it's step one to say this happened, but how do you get step two, which is people to say, yeah, I get it. That did happen. You know what I mean? Which is I think a question that haunts actually this entire conversation, when we talk about, reforms and stable things and everything. Professor Massey, did you have anything you wanted to say to take us out?
Well, I just wanted to thank all the interlocutors. I think you've done a crystal clear expose on the issues that face Black America, not just Black America, but all America. We're a very unequal country. We're unequal both socially and economically, but more particularly spatially. And our inequality has a strong spatial element to it. And it's very highly racialized, and it's increasingly done on the basis of class, and has produced a new political economy, geographic economy in the United States of great inequality by race and class simultaneously. And until we deal with the spatial dimensions of our current inequality, I don't think we'll be able to advance on a piecemeal basis. So I wanted to thank Fred, Pat, Kianga, Kathy, and Ta-Nehisi for laying all this out for us. And this will be a podcast, and people can go back to it and refer to it. And this is the second in a series of presentations. And next fall, the Office of Population Research will be presenting a session on the state of Hispanic America.
Can I ask one question? Ta-Nehisi, we have you here, and I evaluate the state of things by trying to find out how you're thinking about things. Can you leave us in the last minute with your sense of where we're heading, what these pieces of legislation mean, how you're feeling about life in the US right now? And then we'll all log off after we get your final word.
Oh, I hate to end like that. I don't have anything good to say. I mean, it's funny because you guys this is always my experience with academics. I go talk to you guys and you have all the science, but somehow you're more hopeful than me. I see it and I'm like, my God, I started off today just reading about some of the effects, for instance, of gerrymandering in Mississippi, wherein, if I have this right, the guy I was reading, Democrats effectively have to win by 15% in the popular vote to win control of the legislature. And I'm seeing this movement of these bills, across the United States. And I guess this is hopeful. I mean, one of the things that I've thought a lot about is what this highlights is the fact that for so often we've talked about this idea of demographic change. And what is beneath that is the idea that beneath white supremacy is the fact that simply white votes, in other words, quote unquote, white votes outnumber votes of people of color, young people, however you want to put that. And that is the real strength of regressive politics, white supremacy, however you want to put it. But seeing these rules being changed across the country and thinking about it historically, what's become clear to me is that those forces have actually always been anti-democratic. That quote unquote whiteness actually can't merely rule by, in a fair fight, you know what I mean, by assembling, the number of votes, that this actually isn't new. So I guess, the dispiriting aspect of that is to see a side that, is organized against democracy itself, not merely for its particular policy goals, which are counter to some of the policy goals that we've heard today, but against democracy itself. The other side of that, though, is, well, to put it bluntly, when we talk about white people, we have always been talking about a more diverse group of people than, maybe we want to give it credit for. That, secession in the Civil War was not democratic. That shooting Abraham Lincoln in the head was not, an act of democracy. That redemption, was an attempt to overthrow fusion governments. It wasn't, these were not democratic, movements. And, where we find ourselves now, it's not democratic. And so weirdly enough, that hardens because, it does, show the possibility of some, alliances. What the mechanism of that will be when you can't protect voting right now, it seems, on a federal level, I just don't know.
Well, I think the lines of battle have been drawn and the stakes are clear. On one hand, you have the Republican Party, which is officially the party of white racism, white nationalism, xenophobia, and anti-democratic,
right,
and wants to run a white minority government indefinitely. On the other hand, we have a transformed Democratic Party that's no longer talking about bipartisanism and a need to accommodate to other, but to fight and come up with big ideas to counter the repressive approach that the Republican Party has adopted. So I think with that, knowing that's the battle ahead of us, we can move forward. But there's a lot of work to be done.
Thanks so much, guys. This was a pleasure. Wow.
Thanks for doing this, Ta-Nehisi.
Same here.
It was a pleasure for us to have you on board and using your greater 15 minutes of fame than we academics have to make these issues more salient and more public.
Beautiful. In person next time, please.
Yes.
All right. Talk soon.
Next year in Princeton.
Indeed.